Good evening. Welcome to tonight's Mansfield Dialogue. We've got what I think will be a great one for you tonight. I'm Rob Saldine, the director of the Ethics and Public Affairs program at the Mansfield Center. I'm also a professor of political science. Our event tonight is co-sponsored by Pi Sigma Alpha. That's the political science student. And we are live on Zoom and Facebook through both the Mansfield Center and Missoula Community Access Television. This is being taped by MCAT as part of its Media Assistance Grants Program for nonprofit organizations, and it will be available for future viewing. Before we get started, just a few tips for using Zoom. Please make sure that your mic is on mute. For the best viewing experience, we suggest that you use the speaker view. You can find that function in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. And finally, please feel free to comment and pose questions using the chat box function throughout the lecture tonight. With that, I'd now like to hand it over to my colleague, Ramona Grey. Ramona is a professor of political science and a Mansfield Center Fellow. Ramona.
Yes, good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce our guest tonight, Jim Messina. He was named the Obama White House's fixer by the media. Jim Messina is perhaps the world's most successful political and corporate advisor, the mastermind behind President Barack Obama's 2012 re-election campaign. Jim Messina seized the reins on what Bloomberg Business Week dubbed, quote, the highest voltage crash course in executive management ever undertaken, and succeeded, earning the president a second term in the White House. With the guidance of technology's foremost leaders, Jim abandoned a traditional presidential campaign and merging technology and politics in a way that was both unpredictable and unprecedented. Jim's strategies established the modern presidential campaign. Google's executive chairman, Eric Schmidt, called it the best run campaign ever. The American Association of Political Consultants later crowned Messina the campaign strategist of the year. In 2013, Messina launched the Messina Group. In this role, Messina provides strategic consulting to businesses around the world. The firm has been involved in winning public policy campaigns on 5 continents. Since then, Jim has also led the team at the Messina Group in advising over 13 presidents and prime ministers on 5 continents, including the United Kingdom's Theresa May and David Cameron, Mexico's Enrique Peña Nieto, Argentina's Mauricio Macri, Italy's Matteo Renzi, and in 2016 helped Spain's President Mariano Rajoy win a surprising re-election. The Messina Group believes the most interesting problem in the coming years is, does regulation stifle or assist innovation? Clients include Uber, PillPack, Airbnb, Google, Delta Airlines, and over 300 others. In his role, Jim Messina continues to advise democratic organizations on domestic issues in the United States. Previously, Jim served as Deputy Chief of Staff in the President Barack Obama's White House, where he was integral to the passage of the historic healthcare bill, the Economic Stimulus Act, credited with saving the U.S. economy, and the landmark repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Jim earned the Fixer moniker as he worked closely with the president and congressional leaders on both sides of the aisle to pass the Affordable Care Act. For over 20 years, Jim has served as chief of staff for various Senate and House offices on Capitol Hill, where he worked to pass key legislation such as multiple tax cut bills, the Medicare prescription drug bill, and several trade agreements. Jim's most formidable years on the Hill were spent as senior advisor and chief of staff to the former senator and ambassador to China, Max Baucus, when he was chair of the powerful Senate Finance Committee. Messina continues to provide insights on news outlets such as MSNBC, CNN, Bloomberg, Fox News, BBC, and others. He lives in San Francisco and Montana with his wife and their 2 dogs. So I am proud and also pleased to introduce Jim Messina tonight. And don't forget, please, to post your questions in the chat box. Thank you. Jim?
Thank you, Professor Gray. That was a very nice introduction. And I'm also a proud Grizzly graduate, 1993, in political science and journalism. And it is amazing to be back. Everything good that has happened to me in my life started at the university, and going to school in Missoula was the best decision I ever made, with the possible exception of marrying my wife. I've agreed not to cuss, which those of you Montanans on the Zoom know is a big deal to me. And I've also agreed to try to limit my jokes about that agricultural institution in Bozeman. We'll see how I do on both of those things. Okay, so I'm about to share my screen. Hopefully you all can see this. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes about where I think the presidential election is, and a little bit about the US Senate, and then I think Professor Gray's going to ask me a bunch of your questions. Probably more fun to answer your questions, but I'm going to try to start this out. As Professor Gray said, we've helped 13 presidents and prime ministers around the world. And the reason I raise this is not because it's cool or, you know, I'm patting myself on the back. The reason I raise it is really this slide, which is what you're seeing around the world is the continued rise of populism. Some call it nationalism, it depends on where, but it's true in the left and the right. It's true on President Trump on the right, it's true on AOC on the left. It's happened in places like Brexit, France with their challenges, Spain with Vox, and Brazil as well. And it really has fueled this back and forth between parties. The other thing we've seen around the world is the rise of the second or third or fourth or fifth political parties that are running and winning office. The only place you don't see that is the United States of America. And the reason why that is important is because there's no third or fourth parties as an outlet for this anger. Where you see the anger really manifest itself is in the primaries and in each party's base. And I'll talk a little bit about how in my years in politics since I graduated from U of M, the 2 major parties in America have switched bases and really become mirror opposites of what they used to be. But what you're seeing right now is both parties really talking about and worrying about their base. And they spend a lot of time trying to make their own supporters happy before they make swing voters happy. And that is especially true in the case of this presidential election. So I'll talk about what that means and why it's important, but I did want to put it in an international context. And this is what you're seeing everywhere around the world. It's not just the United States. It is amazing as what has happened in 6 months in America and in the presidency. We've had the biggest pandemic in 100 years, the worst social unrest in 50 years, the most difficult economic times we've had in a decade. A sitting Supreme Court justice died during the election, and now we're having a confirmation hearing literally hours before people begin voting. We had the strangest presidential debate in modern American history. We had the first African-American woman ever put on the ticket. A book come out about a sitting president that would have ended any other candidacy, but didn't seem to affect his. And then we had the sitting president get COVID. It is unbelievable what we have all just been through. But the interesting thing is it hasn't moved the race. The race is almost exactly where it was at the conventions in August. Just look at the August numbers and look at where the presidency is now. You know, I am kind of very infamous for hating polls and think that all polls kind of inherently suck. And I'll talk about why if you guys want to get really boring and ask me. But it is amazing that we've seen more tumultuous things happen, and the race is basically not moved at all. And that is just historic. Usually you see bounces all over the place. In 2008 and 2012, the race moved 3 separate times in both Obama elections. Obviously, President Trump had the largest close of any time in American political history and came from basically dead to winning the presidency in 2016. But this race hasn't moved, and it's remarkable in the annals of American political history. The other thing that has happened is the rise of historic levels of early voting. And this is really going to make election night a very, very long few days. And the reason I say that is 4 years ago, only 5.9 million people had voted at this point, because most states didn't start this early. As of this morning, we had 40.4 million people already voted. And that's true in Montana as well, where as of this afternoon, 279,240 people voted, which is almost 58% of the people who voted in the entire 2016 presidential election in Montana. And so while we're getting ready for election day in 299 hours, by the way, the polls close, people are already casting votes. So while these polls are interesting to look at, for geeks like me, we have actual data. We know who these 40 million people are. Both campaigns have models of them. We know what we think is happening in these races, and it's much bigger and better than any poll. And it's why you see both campaigns kind of really starting to change the way they're doing business, because they're actually figuring out who has voted. It's interesting, by the way, that at the beginning of the pandemic, the Republican Secretary of State of Washington and the Democratic Secretary of State of Oregon held a joint call with all of the Secretary of States in the country. And they said, look, one of us is a Democrat, one of us is a Republican, but we're both from all early vote, all mail-in ballot states. And if you don't change your laws to allow counting of the votes early, to allow longer time for people to have ballots, to make sure people sign them correctly and chase ballots that are incorrectly filled out, you are going to have a catastrophe on your hands on election night. I'm sad to report that in most of the battleground states, they didn't change their laws, and there's been huge problems in the primary. In New York, we didn't know who 2 members of Congress were for over a month on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, in the Georgia U.S. Senate primaries, there was complete chaos, and they didn't even know what the rules were. And so I think we are in for a very difficult election eve. This is the map that elected President Trump. 306 electoral votes, 232 electoral votes for Hillary Clinton. For those of you from Montana State University, you need 270 electoral votes to get elected President of the United States. This is the map. But the interesting thing about this map is President Trump really won the presidency because of 3 states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. He won those 3 states by a combined 77,744 votes combined. That is less than is in one of the college football stadiums in those 3 states on any given Saturday. And so that margin is really important, and it really kind of dictates 2 things. Why Democrats have PTSD, or bedwetting as I call it, and they're so nervous about the polls. And why President Trump is really more worried about his base than he is swing voters, because he understands that there are more people that should have voted for him in 2016 in these Midwestern states than should have voted for the Democrats. And I'll talk about why that's important in a second. Sadly for all of us, this is not a national election. All these national polls that you see every day don't matter. There's only about 8 to 10 states that actually matter. In fact, I threatened to fire my staff in the Obama campaign if they looked at polls, because the only polls I cared about were the polls in these early or in these battleground states. And while, the other thing is, for those of you who look at the polls every day, first of all, you have better things to do with your time. Second of all, if you're going to look at polls, the only polls you should look at are realclearpolitics.com. And the reason I say this, and this is what both parties look at, because they average every single poll in every single race in America. And so they kind of combine all of those things. And so you're not getting these outlier polls. I'm pretty sure my in-laws from Billings are watching right now. And about every day, my mother-in-law sends me some scary poll and says, "Are we screwed?" And I send her Real Clear Politics and say, "Mama, see, it's okay. We'll be okay." But the national race is about 9 points in Real Clear Politics. But if you look at the states that actually matter, a big majority of them are within 4 or 5 points, within basically the margin of error. Really close races like Arizona, like Florida, which is the 1% state. It doesn't matter who wins it, Republicans or Democrats, it's always 1%. Like Michigan, Wisconsin actually has gone much bigger and is outside the margin of error, but Pennsylvania, which right now, 94% of the time in the simulations we run every night, the winner of Pennsylvania wins the presidency. That's within the margin of error. So while the vice president has kind of a very big lead on early vote and lead in the polls, in the actual battleground states, this race is much closer. And it's why, neither side is taking anything for granted. The other reason anyone can't take anything for granted is because, of course, in the middle of this, the way campaign in America absolutely has changed. Gone are the days on the Democratic side when you could just everything you could on the ground, door knocking, rallies, field, to get everyone to vote. Gone are President Trump's superpowers of big rallies. And President Trump built the largest staff ever for door knocking. Both campaigns have started doing some limited door knocking, but in the middle of this, they've had to completely change the way they do these things. The Biden campaign is now doing drive-in movie rallies, which I promise you 6 months ago, no one had ever heard of. The Trump campaign is focusing almost exclusively on digital, which I think is very smart. But in the middle of trying to win a presidency, suddenly both campaigns couldn't do what they're good at. And that too has really changed the election. What the rules are actually going to be. And this is just unprecedented. So let me just, remind people of where we are. So you don't and whether they'll be allowed to introduce or announce the election results either on election night for the same day people who voted on election night or the people who voted early. So if that's not enough chaos, and a reminder, please to everyone, put me on mute if you would. If that's not enough chaos, then you talk about the issues. And traditionally in American politics, all presidential elections are about the economy. When I ran Obama's campaign, about 2 o'clock in the morning, once a month, Bill Clinton would wake me up and he would say in his beautiful Southern voice, "Jim, all elections are always about the economy." Well, that has always been true in every other race I've ever worked on anywhere around the country or world, except for now. And there's this axiom in American politics that you can survive one major problem if you're the incumbent. And for President Obama, it was a difficult economy that was beginning to recover. No one's ever survived 2 or 3. President Trump's problem is, as I said earlier, he's got a difficult economy, he's got the pandemic, and he has racial unrest. And so if you look at these numbers, coronavirus outbreak, Biden leads by 12. Criminal justice, which is an issue that President Trump thought was going to win in the White House, Biden leads by 4. The thing that is holding President Trump up, the thing, especially in the battleground states where some of the states are too close to call, is the economy. He still has a narrow lead. And that's a big deal because, reminder, he lost the last election by 3 points nationally, but he won these battleground states because he was seen as better on the economy. And he continues to have that advantage. And that is kind of what's keeping this race close. And it's why you haven't seen kind of a breakout like Obama did in 2008, like Reagan did in 1980. And this number one is why this race continues to be close. The interesting thing is, and this came out yesterday in the Financial Times, voters are now beginning to change on this. And this is the problem President Trump has. If I was his campaign manager, I would say to him, every moment you're not talking about the economy, you're losing. And that's what I did say to President Obama. When you're talking about COVID, when you're talking about Hunter Biden, when you're talking about everything else, you're losing. And this number shows you the ground that Biden has made up on these issues, but it remains a close election. The two campaigns in the middle of trying to reinvent themselves have wildly different views on how to do this. In many ways, President Trump is running the 2012 Obama campaign. He's spending a huge amount of his money on digital advertising. He's believing very deeply in Facebook. He's burying Biden on TikTok, which I promise Professor Gray and Selden, you and I don't know anything about, on Snapchat, on other things, because they believe that's where voters are. Vice President Biden's campaign, including its super PACs, are absolutely spending money on television. And they are outspending President Trump 2-to-1 this month and last month. And in some of the big battleground states that are really going to matter, like Michigan, like Pennsylvania, like Wisconsin, they're outspending the president 3-to-1. And we've just never seen that. Also in Florida, just one Democratic donor, former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg, is spending $100 million against the president trying to help Vice President Biden. And if you go to Florida, you've seen it's the second most television ads in the country for the average person. Little trivia question for all of you. What state are there more television ads per capita than any state in the country? Yes, Montana. And we'll talk about the US Senate race in a second. People ask me all the time who benefits for higher turnout. And there's this belief in Washington that it is the Democrats. And that belief is incorrect. The answer to that is it depends on where you're talking about. In the Midwest battleground states of Michigan, Minnesota, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, there are more non-college white voters who traditionally heavily favor President Trump than there are what we call the Democratic Emerging Coalition of college white voters and non-white voters. And so this is why President Trump continues to go to these places and speak what the press keeps saying is just to his base. And what he's trying to do is jack up turnout from all these people who should have voted for him in 2016, but didn't. 2.2 million people are in his base in Pennsylvania and didn't vote for him last time. That is why, traditionally both parties would have raced to the middle and talked about moderate issues. And the president doesn't care about swing women voters because he knows he can't get them. He's trying to jack up turnout. And it's a very smart tactic on one hand. This is exactly what George Bush did in 2004 when John Kerry was sure he'd won the presidency, and he lost it because George Bush turned out 100,000 people in Ohio that nobody saw coming. And that is Trump's lifeline. But in these new states where Democrats have not competed, like Arizona, which no Dem has won since 1992, and I wanted badly for Obama, but couldn't win it either time. Like Florida, like Georgia, where no Democrat has won since 1988. Like North Carolina, where only Barack Obama has won since 1964. Like Texas, which hasn't gone D since 1964. Those states are suddenly in play. And it's not because of President Trump or Vice President Biden. It's because there's so many of these people in the blue coalition of college white and non-white voters. And there's many, many more that are in Trump's coalition. And it's why both parties are kind of looking at new maps that look very, very different from the Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump map or the Barack Obama maps. And that has kind of changed American politics. The question I get all the time, and it's a very fair question, and Professor Selden was asking me about this, is are the polls going to be wrong again? And I think two things about it. Number one, what did we learn early from my lecture? The Bobcats suck, and so do polls. And we know that hidden Trump voters do exist. I think that polls do underestimate the president's support. I don't think they underestimate it enough to come back from a 9-point lead nationally. But it is true that some groups, and there's been really good studies from lesser universities like Harvard and University of Chicago on this topic. And there are some people who don't want to tell a pollster that they support President Trump for whatever reason, especially in some age or education level and income levels. And so, you know, I tell people all the time when they say, should yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Rob, go ahead.
Ramona, should I go ahead?
I'm sorry, Jim. I think Rob was just going to note that your Wi-Fi has been cutting out, and I don't know if it'd be easier if you turned off your video for the rest of your presentation and then turned it back on during the Q&A.
Yeah, let me see how I can do that. Sorry, you guys. Welcome to Clyde Park, Montana. 1 second. Yeah. Okay. Can you guys still see my screen, or you probably can't, right, Ramona?
This is perfect. We see your PowerPoint.
Oh, great. Perfect. Okay. So here's the next thing I want to say to you is the two parties have switched bases in the past 15 years. When I was growing up and was an undergrad in Missoula, Democrats were the non-college white voters. They are now 24% Republican. If you had a postgraduate degree, you're Republican, or if you are a young voter, you're Republican. And now those folks have gone Democratic. Republicans have made huge inroads with white voters, with Catholic voters. And so both bases have literally switched in 20 years, and that has literally changed American politics. And it's why it's so difficult to figure out who to poll and what's been happening. The other thing that is going to be incredibly interesting on election day is key Senate races. As I said earlier, there's more spending in Montana. Today, if you want to buy a television commercial in Montana, it is more expensive than a television commercial in New York or Los Angeles. And that is absolutely crazy. There's a few races that are going to decide control of the United States Senate. These are those races. There are two races that aren't on here, which both parties already have decided that the other party is going to lose. Colorado Republican Cory Gardner is going to lose, and Democratic Alabama Senator Doug Jones is likely to lose. Democrats need 3 seats to take over control of the US Senate if they win the White House, or 4 if they don't. And there are 7 races that are considered toss-up within the margin of error, including the closest race of all, Montana. And then an interesting trivia point, which 2016 was the first time ever that the party that won the presidency in that state won the Senate race in every single state. So if you go back to this earlier one, it really matters who's going to win Iowa. It really matters, who's going to win North Carolina. But can Steve Bullock, be able to withstand Donald Trump's win in Montana, which will almost assuredly occur? Can the best Republican candidate in the country, James in Michigan, beat an incumbent when Joe Biden's going to win Michigan handily? And so just for political geeks like all of us, it is a very, very interesting thing. And then we're having races in places where they shouldn't be competitive races. I'll pick on Kansas for a second. There has not been a Democrat has not won a Kansas US Senate race since 1932. And right now that is tied. Democrats aren't expected to win any of these, but this kind of shows you what could be a blue wave on election day, the fact that all these are so close. And they're in places that just shouldn't be this close. And so that's a challenge if you're Republicans going into election day. So with that, sorry about my bad internet. Hopefully you got most of my Bobcat jokes, and I'm more than happy to answer any question you'd like to ask me.
Thank you, Jim. That was great. We have a question from Keegan, who notes that at the beginning of your presentation, you said that there's a global surge of populism. And she was interested to know what your theories are that explain this surge of populism.
Yeah, so this I don't know if Keegan's in school right now, but Keegan, the folks in school right now's generation is the first generation in world history that doesn't believe that their future is going to be brighter than their parents' future. And that tacit admission or belief is why there's so much anger. And it's a fair anger. And people believe that the modern political establishment of both parties has failed it. And so, there are no great answers for what is the future. And then people, especially across the world, look at the internet, look at American social media companies and say, where are the jobs going to come from? There aren't factories. All the jobs are kind of in tech. They all seem to be going to America and China. What is our economic future? And when people are worried about things, sometimes they go to anger and sometimes they go to other places. And what we've seen in the past 5 to 10 years is where they go is sort of into protectionism. Both left and right say, let's pull up the drawbridges and let's, get rid of trade agreements and let's get rid of some of these, sharing things, and let's just tend to our own knitting. Let's take care of our own challenges. And let's not worry so much about the international order. We know that long-term, we all need each other, especially to cure things like climate change and other things. But what you're seeing is when people get nervous about this, they're going to some of these more populist and nationalistic tendencies. And that is just what's happening all over the world.
Great, thank you. Could you turn your video on so we can see you and turn off the...
Oh, sure, cool.
Yeah. And let me see. There we go. Great. All right. Thank you. So one of the other questions we have is from, is from McKenna, and she says well, what advice would you give for how we can mentally prepare for the turbulent election week ahead, as you referred?
Half gin, half tonic. No, it's a great question. I would say 2 things. Number 1, don't read the polls because they're garbage. Number 2, understand that it may be a couple days before we know who's going to be the president of the United States, and that's okay. In states like Montana, we're used to this. John Tester has never gone to sleep on election night knowing if he's won or lost. And he woke up the next day and still lived and breathed and ended up winning. So everyone just needs to take a deep breath. And the other thing is we're definitely not going to know who's in control of the U.S. Senate. We probably won't know that until January 5th when there are 2 runoff elections in Georgia. So we're going to have a bunch of long kind of waiting. Everyone needs to be calm because the worry is social unrest, right? And we just need the people to do their jobs, count the ballots, and figure out the court cases, and we'll all figure this out. And as always, Montana is ahead of the world, and we've already had these close elections, and if everyone would just do what we say, it would be a better country.
Well, you clearly do not like polls, and so as a follow-up, why should we ignore them? Why do they suck?
So they suck for a couple of reasons. They suck because most public polls don't have the money to do them right. 2, it's illegal to call cell phones unless you've been given permission, which means you have to buy cell phone numbers, which are incredibly expensive. So like when you see, there's a poll from the Agricultural Institution in Bozeman that doesn't use cell phone numbers and has always been a kind of bad poll that is not well regarded. That's my 3rd Bobcat joke, Ramona. I'm just going to continue with it until someone tells me to shut up. And then the other thing is, there is inherent bias. The average undecided voter is 58% women. Of those, the average single mother has 2.5 jobs. Good luck getting them on a landline phone. Good luck getting young voters on landline phones. Traditionally, they've really underestimated Democratic support across the country of young voters. And then again, people lie. Here's an interesting statistic. You spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to get people to actually tell you how they're going to vote since you know that they lie to pollsters. And we tested over 300 different ways. And the #1 most predictive way of how you're going to vote is where do you get your daily political news? And if you get it from Fox, welcome to Donald Trump. If you get it from MSNBC, please watch me on Morning Joe and vote for Joe Biden. If you get it from CNN, or sorry, if you get it from the 10 o'clock news in your home city, you're probably a swing voter. And so, you know, those are just reasons why I don't like polls. And to be fair, the polls weren't completely wrong about President Trump. They said he was going to lose by 2 or 3 points, and he lost the national vote by 2 or 3 points. The polls were just really wrong in the states. And the states are harder to poll for the reasons I just talked about.
Okay, good. Actually, following up, because we have another question, the poll related question, so I'll continue with that theme for a moment. And that is, the question has come up, given the tumultuous events in the last month, the polls haven't moved at all.
I am, unlike my Bobcat jokes, I'm trying very hard to be nonpartisan here. My overall theory is just a nonpartisan political analyst, is that the country has decided. And the country has decided very early. You know, America is now the most partisan country in the world. Only about 8 to 10% of Americans could actually vote for both Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And the other 90 to 92% have already decided. And especially when you have a polarizing president like President Trump that has kind of the smallest bandwidth since the day President Trump got elected to now. He's had the least amount of up or down in his approval ratings of any president ever. And I don't say polarizing in a bad way. Please, Republicans on the call, don't. I'm not taking a shot. It just is true that he's more polarizing. And so, of course, the race is going to be less jumpy, because a huge majority of people have already decided where they're going to vote. And the people that haven't, whatever that number is, 3%, 5%, 7%, in a Montana poll yesterday, the undecided was 2% in the Senate race. They're going to wait as long as they can to make up this decision, because, you know, they have lives to lead, and they have 2.5 jobs, and they got kids, and, you know, they're more interested in the Bronco game this weekend than they are making this decision.
Okay. From Mariah, we have a question. If traditional methods aren't necessarily the best course of action anymore for organizers, what methods should rural organizers be using to get out the vote for candidates they're working for? What advice would you give to young rural organizers?
Oh, that's a great question. So my very first job in Montana politics, my region was from Red Lodge to Wolf Point, and I would hesitate to say you get much more rural than that, and I loved it. And so thank you for the question. It's incredibly important. The first thing is show up, have a conversation, talk less than you listen. Understand that people, no matter where they live, are all super great people that just may have different politics than you, but want to talk about the issues. The second thing is, don't get too hooked up. And this is what 2020 has taught us. Don't get too hooked up on how you talk to voters, because there used to be all this research that says a door knock is more effective than anything else. But there's been recent post-pandemic or during pandemic research that shows that now a touch on Facebook, a touch on email, a phone call is as effective as a door knock, and that includes in rural. You know, I live in a very small Clyde Park, Montana, and I can tell you there's more stuff going on the Shields Valley Facebook page than anything else. It's our lifeline, and we discuss everything but politics there. And that's a good place to go to start to kind of listen and learn. And people used to do it over, you know, bingo and beers at the Murray Bar in Livingston. And they now do it on Facebook, and that's okay. Just communicate and listen and have an honest conversation.
Well, this is from also a participant here that's on the other side of the age spectrum, but similar question. And that is, she says, I'm 77 years old and I've already voted. Is there anything else I can do?
Oh, that's great. Yes, is the short answer. Look at your Christmas card list, or look at your church list, or look at the list of people you love, and call or Facebook or email every single one of them. Call up whichever candidate you support locally and volunteer to make some calls. Or if you don't like making phone calls, put stamps on pieces of mail, or, you know, just find some way to touch people. Because the biggest fear about the election, and one of the unknowns is, are places like Missoula and Bozeman going to vote? Are the students going to vote at the numbers they usually vote? And, you know, will people want to come out in a pandemic? If you're 77, are you going to want to leave the house and go vote? She already voted, and that's awesome. But some people might not. Offer to give people a ride. Ask them if they got their ballot already. See if you can pick up their ballot. You know, do those things just to help people. And I don't care who you support. Our democracy is strengthened if we have, you know, big turnout. And the election in 2018 was the highest non-presidential turnout in 102 years. And this presidential turnout may break records as well. And that's super great. And it's super important. And while politics right now kind of seems ugly and people are cynical about it, you know, the youth of America right now at the University of Montana are 3.5 times more likely to be involved in politics than any generation ever, including Vietnam. They just do it in a different way. They're doing it online. They're doing it with Facebook and Snapchat. They're talking about issues and not partisanship. And that's awesome. And they get way too much grief for it. And so I think that, you know, find a way and spend the next 299 hours trying to figure out a way you can convince your friends.
Great. We have a couple questions here wanting to know what you think about the Electoral College. Do you think we should keep the Electoral College? What are your thoughts?
Oh boy, yes. So I've gone back and forth on this more times than anything, and I don't have a great answer, because on one hand, the Electoral College is very good because it makes presidential candidates have to go to places like Iowa and Montana and other places. If there were no Electoral College, guys like me who are running presidential campaigns would send their candidates to 10 cities over and over and over. You'd go to only the population places. You would never, ever go to Montana. You would never go to small states like New Hampshire or like, you know, Iowa. You would just go to the population centers because you'd want to get another 500,000 votes. And that's just true. And I think that'd be bad. On the other hand, you know, it is true that I just said to you, there are only 8 to 10 states that matter because of the Electoral College. And so, you know, I go back and forth. Here's what I know. I know there has to be a better system. And I think, you know, there's been proposals to have states split their electoral votes. So, you know, 45% of Montanans voted for Joe Biden, he'd get some electoral votes, you know, one of the 3 or something. There's lots of proposals. This is something that the next generation will have to do. But I go back and forth about whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. And every time the president gets elected and loses the popular vote, I decide it's a bad thing. And every time that, you know, candidates have to knock on doors, presidential candidates knocking on doors in all 99 counties in Iowa, I decide it's a good thing. And so, you know, there's no great answer here.
Okay. I have a couple of questions for you. Actually, I have some questions for you. You know, this is the eve of the next and last presidential debate. And do you think we're going to see a replay of the last debate except with a mute button? And do you think it's going to make any difference to the, what, 5% of undecided voters if they're out there?
Let me answer your question. They're great questions. Let me answer them in backwards order. It absolutely will make a difference because these voters who haven't made up their mind are going to start to tune in. And our research in both Obama campaigns showed that it's not even if they watch the debate, it's the news coverage of the debate in the 24 hours that really matters. And now with the online stuff, let me tell you a funny but harrowing story. In 2012, Barack Obama lost the first presidential debate to Mitt Romney, worse than any president had ever lost a debate. Swing voters said that Romney beat him 89-11. And in the 2008 election, I hadn't gone to the debates. I'd been in Chicago at the campaign headquarters. So this is my first presidential debates. And we're watching backstage as we just get destroyed. And David Axelrod, the president's senior advisor and close friend, looked at me and said, "Hey, Messina, do you know the bad part about being the president's campaign manager?" And I said, "No, David, what?" And he kicks the door open to the spin room with 2,000 reporters and he says, "You first." and pushes me in there. And 2,000 reporters started laughing when I said we won this debate because it was obvious we had lost. And then we came back and Obama did much better in the second and third debates and rescued the campaign, and we ended up winning. The first debate was so bad, I think, both for democracy and for presidential debates, and hopefully was the end of the debate commission forever, that I think you're going to see a different President Trump. People forget in 2016, he performed not that great in the first two debates, and actually the third debate, when it really mattered, when he was starting to move and he wanted to convince voters it was normal, he was really good, and he wasn't as ugly, and he wasn't just kind of hitting of Hillary. He smiled more and he made a few jokes. And if I was advising his campaign, this is what I think will happen. You will see him be better at this. He'll still need to go after Biden because he's behind in the polls. But in part, expectation games really matter in debates. And after how bad he was in the first debate, I made this joke on Twitter today that I thought was going to really blow up on Twitter, and no one followed me. But my line was, if he shows up and actually comes to the debate and doesn't set himself on fire, people will say he won the debate. And that's kind of what I think. But yes, I think it'll matter to swing voters how it actually occurs. The other interesting thing is, the first debate was interesting because male voters thought the debate was about tied in the focus groups, and female voters thought Biden won by 30 points. And so it really is different how, different demographics, different age groups, and the genders see this race differently.
Okay, interesting. Let's see, Gwen, I would like to know how are the hearings and ultimate vote on Amy Coney Barrett's nomination to Supreme Court impacting this election in terms of the issues as well as voter turnout, do you think?
Well, it's a great question, Amy. And actually, it most affected something you didn't mention, which is money. Since RBG's passing, in the first 10 days of that, Democratic candidates from president to the House races were given $250 million online by supporters. And some of these races in these big Senate races that really matter in a Supreme Court hearing, like South Carolina, like Montana, got tens of millions of dollars. And it went from basically an even money race between the two parties to this massive Democratic advantage. And anyone who turns on the TV sees that Democratic advantage on TV. As far as swing voters, they don't tend to focus as much on Supreme Court hearings. They want to know how these two candidates are going to make their family lives better. And I've spent, 25 years of my life trying to figure out how to make Supreme Court fights more important to swing voters, and have yet to do it. And what you kind of see overall is the Supreme Court fight hasn't affected the presidential race, except for money.
Okay, interesting. And then also from Daisy, the question is, I think people my age, Daisy's a university student, I think people my age fear that the election results will not be trusted, especially after the president talked about not respecting election results. Is that something you're concerned about?
Yes, it is absolutely something I'm concerned about. And I'm concerned about it for two reasons. Again, on election day, the question I got asked earlier, most states have to be very specific about how they report their numbers. And President Trump has told his supporters not to early vote, that he wants them to vote on election day. And the reason he wants that is because the first numbers you'll see on election night will be people who voted actually on election day. And then they will start counting in most states. This is not true everywhere, but in most battleground states, then they'll start counting the early votes. Because in states like, Pennsylvania, they can't even open the early ballots to start counting them until after the polls close, which again is why it's going to take a while to figure this out. And so there is a chance that the early numbers scare every Democrat and make every Republican happy. And then the early vote, and President Trump could declare a winner, himself the winner. The networks have already talked about this. The Washington Post has decided they won't say any candidate has won on election day in congressional and the presidency because they want to see all the ballots, and they won't know what percentage were early. whether, what the turnout really was, early versus same day. The various networks are talking about how they're going to cover the race and what they're going to say. I think, what geeks like me are going to watch are a few counties in battleground states, like Cobb County in Georgia, like the I-4 corridor in Florida, that will report very early, like Texas, which report very early. And if Biden is doing significantly better than Hillary did in 2016, that'll say something. If Trump has strength like he did in 2016 that we didn't see coming, that'll say something as well. But, I agree with Amy's question and think that it is one of the fears that I go to sleep with every night. Okay.
And this from Ray. Who do you think will win the Montana state races for Congress and governor?
That is too close to call. Every single poll has the Senate race tied, the congressional race pretty close. They are just, Montana is a close state. We are just a divided state. I think coming into this, you would have thought Republicans have an advantage. Republicans have about a 6-point advantage on party identification. 6% more people in Montana say they're Republicans and Democrats, but a plurality say they're independents. And it's very, very close with those voters. And, I was doing this TV thing today with this guy who's known as an expert on state politics. And he said that Montana was probably the closest US Senate race in America. And I don't think anyone knows who's going to win.
Wow, okay. Well, actually, we're going to be wrapping this up actually in about 8:15, but we'll take a couple more questions if you're willing.
Sure.
All right. As President Trump is continuing to have 2 or 3 rallies per day thus far, how concerning or concerned would you be if you were the campaign advisor to Vice President Biden with the amount of, I think it is, campaigning and calling he's been doing?
Yeah, I used to be the White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, and the safety and security of the White House was one of my things. And so I spent a lot of time worrying about pandemics and health scares and all of these things. And I think that, what is true is I think the Biden campaign is being very careful on how they do their events. They're insisting on social distancing. It makes it super hard to do the event. If you see some of the events, they aren't kind of as exciting as a traditional rally. I always like rallies to seem like the fourth quarter of a game at Washington Grizzly Stadium in a tied football game. And right now they kind of seem more like academic treatises like this. And let me promise you, I'm not a candidate for anything. And so I think that's hard. I don't agree with the president's decision to have rallies without masks. I think it's reckless, but I understand that people need to win and want to do what they have to do.
All right, I've got another question here. So many people so many people talk about climate change, this question raises, and at least one of the biggest issues. But one participant here wants to know, if it's not the biggest issue, why is it not on your list of the 3? And I think
you broke up for a second. Why is what?
Why is climate change not on? It didn't appear to be on your list of the major issues.
Because when you look at what voters say are the issues that move them, when you look at, if you look at young voters, climate change is on this. Social justice is number 1 for young voters and climate change is number 2. But I put that list up there because when you ask people what their most important issue is and what their issue is that they'll decide the race on, climate change is not in the top 5. It is for some demographics. It is very important to me personally. But for swing voters, for American voters, it just isn't.
Why do you think that's the case?
It's a great question, because in a bunch of the other countries I do politics in, it is. And candidates are, across parties kind of fighting to be the more environmental candidate. I think Americans put economic issues first. And I think they think of these things in economic terms. Even though I think that, the vice president has tried hard to say that, climate change is also about infrastructure and jobs and green technologies. He's tried to make that connection, but it's yet to sort of work with swing voters.
Okay. This one from Denise. Will Trump supporters voting on the election day backfire if lines are long? They could give up. And this voted in Colorado. Need to mail in early, right? But will that backfire if there's long lines? Or I guess, which candidate could that backfire on if there's long lines during election days?
Yeah, this was always the Obama fear, right? We always were worried about long lines on election day, and we always had them. And this kept me up for 2 presidential elections. President Trump supporters, Republicans tend to be same-day voters and always have been. I've become weirdly close friends with the guy who ran Mitt Romney's campaign when I ran Obama's campaign. And he says, Jim, I can't tell you why, but we are same-day voters. If you look at enthusiasm numbers, President Trump's supporters are more enthusiastic than any group of people about voting. And I think they will wait in these voting lines, and it won't be a problem for him. Because if you like Donald Trump, you really like Donald Trump, and you will vote. And they've shown that over and over and over.
Wow. Okay. And I presume too, it's going to be a huge voter turnout.
Yeah, I think it's going to break records. Yeah, I think, we'll see. But the early vote numbers say that it's going to be the biggest in our lifetime.
Okay. I have another question here from Silas. Your thoughts on the people that are decrying a potential coup threat? I guess they want to know. What are your thoughts on that?
I worry about, we've just gone through real unrest. We've seen difficult times. And if you look last week at there being a plot to kidnap the governor of the state of Michigan. And, America's gone through some of these things before. Ramona and I remember when the mayor of San Francisco was assassinated, and, when Ronald Reagan was shot, and, America's had these issues before. And it's, it is something that I do worry about. I don't know about a coup. I think there is real leadership on both parties. You saw Mitch McConnell, who clearly is not my favorite human being, but did the right thing and said, it doesn't matter that I'm a Republican. Whoever wins on election day is going to be my president. And there needs to be more people like that. That is something that where Pelosi and McConnell and Schumer and Kevin McCarthy, the Republican leader, have all said the right things. And I'm hopeful that America will read its political history and realize what in the end killed the Roman Empire. And it was division from within. And we all really are one country.
Just as a kind of a wrap up to question for me here is certainly we're talking a lot about our polarization right now in the country, right? We're very divided in that. What are your thoughts, Jim, about trying to transcend that polarization? What or who or will bring us together, reunite us?
It's a great question. And I don't think there's an answer for it. I do believe it will occur because we've gone through this. I know my journalism professors are on this call, and, they remind me of the muckraker days when, there was more partisanship in newspapers than there was in anything else. And we figured that out with a fairness clause, and, we evolved. I really do think it's more conversations like this. I think it's more people sitting in rooms and sitting in chat rooms and talking to their friends and family. Part of what we've stopped doing is communicating with people who don't share our political beliefs. And that is why that statistic I told you that the most predictive thing is where you get your news. Because if you're like, I always use my dad as an example. My dad just consumes left news all day, every day. If Rachel Maddow told him to jump off a bridge, he'd be running for the door. And his cousin, who's his best friend, consumes Republican news all day, every day. And they're best friends, but they can't talk about politics anymore because they can't agree on the truth. And we got to figure out ways to bridge that. Because, our economic competitors are, there's very clear plans from China and from other places, and we got to get some consensus on things. And the thing that makes me hopeful is there actually is consensus in the country on what to do on education and climate change and immigration reform. The only thing that's broken is politics. And if we can figure that out, we can get there. And again, Montana leads the way. Like Montana had, you know, a very conservative state legislature and a, you know, progressive Democrat as governor, and got a ton done, had a balanced budget, did Medicare expansion, did a bunch of other controversial things, and did it kind of bipartisanly. And so part of it is we all know each other and we can sit together and figure these things out. And we're not as partisan in Montana. And so you know, not to rip off a Bullock line from his TV ads, but Washington needs to look a little more like Montana.
Okay. Well, now's your part. Now you can certainly inspire some new young people in politics right now. Here's your moment, Jim. Question is from Darby. How did you get your career started in politics?
This is a great question. Thanks, Darby. When I was an undergraduate at the University of Montana, I was political science and journalism, and I knew very early that I loved politics. And I got a U of M president's internship at the Montana State Legislature. And I got to be an intern in the 1991 legislature for 4 members of the state legislature. And I came back from that experience knowing there was nothing else I ever wanted to do with my life. And so I left U of M 3 times when I was an undergraduate to go work on campaigns in paid and unpaid positions. Bill Chalupka, my political science professor, and Dennis Weibold, who's still in the journalism school, both gave me internship credits so I could keep my student loans and afford to eat. And I wrote really boring papers about voter turnout. And the day I graduated from the university, I became the political director of the state Democratic Party. Because Montana was still a place where, you know, it doesn't matter if you're Democrat or Republican, you can get a job in Montana politics. You can rise very, very quickly because we're a small state. And my friends who kind of worked their way up, Axelrod always teases me about this, took him 25 years to get to the top of Chicago politics. And in Montana, you know, I was, I think, 3 years before I moved to Washington to work for Max. Montana's just a place where you can do that. And you have a university that kind of wants you to do those things and wants you to succeed and do internships and work at the Mansfield Center and do all those things. And that just is not true when you go to, you know, big schools.
Well, we're certainly proud of you. Okay, that certainly is something. One of the other questions is again a follow-up to the polarization one too, is asked, could you say more about how we could get agreement on these big issues that we don't seem to agree upon? I mean, how do you bring people together?
It's a great question. And, you know, I do a lot of paid debates where I debate Karl Rove, who was George Bush's version of me, probably smarter and definitely older. And he and I kind of agree that there is like 70% of Americans that agree on what an immigration bill would look like. 65% of Americans could agree on what a climate change bill would look like. The problem is twofold. The problem is both bases of both parties want what they want and don't want compromise. And two, that the political leadership in Washington views their jobs is to take care of their parties first and to compromise second. And so I think it kind of starts with people demanding some movement and not being sort of, you know, my way or the highway. President Obama makes Democrats mad every time he talks about this, but he did it again today in Pennsylvania, where he reminded people we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And, you know, politics is compromise. And we got to figure out ways to compromise on some of these things. Because like climate change, you know, is a passion of mine and my wife's. And you know, the earth is decaying at an incredible rate. And we could wait until we could pass the perfect bill, or we could pass a bill that starts to make things better right now. And so I think those are the choices in front of us.
Okay, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the last bit of what you said. You kind of cut out.
Oh, sorry. And those are the choices that are in front of us. You know, do you want to make some moderate change, or do you want to, kind of wait for the perfect bill? You know, as Ramona said, I did help shepherd the Obamacare through Congress, and there was lots of criticism among the base of the Democratic Party that wasn't liberal enough. Well, but it was national health care, and 100 million Americans like my wife who had a pre-existing condition could get health insurance. And it was a step. And there was a big fight about whether that step was enough. And, you know, sometimes you got to take what you can get.
Mhm. Okay, good. We're almost just about out of time, but I've got another question here. Well, actually, a couple of them. This one is interesting. What are the chances that DC and Puerto Rico may become states and affect elections?
Zero. Every time I'm on Fox News, they ask me this 20 different ways. And it's just not going to happen. There are too many small states like Montana, like South Dakota, like North Dakota that would never want that to happen. And so whether it should happen, as a former 25-year resident of DC, I have some views on that, but it's not going to happen. But it is a favorite right-wing talking point of Fox News.
Well, should it happen? I can't help follow up on that.
Well, I think it is fair to say that people that are Americans in those places certainly believe it should. And there are people who are unfranchised. And the fact that if you live in DC and you don't get to vote, you know, you don't have an elected representative to fight for you. I think it's a fair argument that they are viewed differently as other Americans.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then this is for Lorraine. What fundamental force explains the universal overarching U.S. Senate denial of attention to progressive societal change that accrues to the benefit of all people?
That is an awesome question. And the answer is mostly age. And honestly, you know, the U.S. Senate was built by the framers, and literally was in some of the argument papers about the U.S. Constitution, that the U.S. Senate was the saucer that would cool the angry drink of the House, and that bills are supposed to go to the Senate to die according to the framers, and, you know, to wait until they're ready. That has been unbelievably frustrating to me, and as someone who worked in the U.S. Senate for 13 years. It was insanely frustrating to me. And when I was trying to help pass Obamacare, I wanted to change the US Senate to a monarchy very quickly. But the truth is that when you look at some of those, you know, it was designed to have 2 members from each state. And so a state like Montana is as powerful as a state like California. And when you do that, and when you have rules like cloture of 60 votes, it is very hard. You need consensus. Long term, that is probably a good thing. And that people around the world know what the rule of law is, and they know what the tax code is, and they know what these things are, because they don't change every 2 years by who's in power, because the US Senate doesn't allow it. But when you're trying to pass historic things like climate change, like healthcare, the US Senate's always a problem for both parties. And I promise you that no matter who's the next president is, they're going to think to themselves, my God, I hate the US Senate, at least once a week during their entire presidency.
I also, just as a follow-up too to that, I had Chuck Hagel some time ago speak in my class, and Senator Hagel, and he, the class was it was very fascinating, and he spoke about the difficulty now of there being really moderate, you know, senators on both sides of the aisle. It seems as though they're very, you know, again, very polarized. And he talked about this being perhaps even a generational thing. And I'm wondering your thoughts are we going to get moderate Republicans, Democrats again, or is there no return?
Yeah, we will. You know, there's proposals on ways to do it. More and more states are adopting the California rules of a jungle primary, meaning the top 2 in the primary get to the general. So you may have moderates of both parties get through instead of, you know, both parties nominating people from their kind of strident bases. I think you will see people sort of start to get demands some people can work together. Because, you know, when I go back to Washington, when I talk to members of both parties, they understand they're not doing anything. They understand they've had years of fighting, and they didn't go there to do nothing either. they want some change. And I'm hopeful. I think you need some campaign finance reform. You need some redistricting reform. Of the 435 members of Congress, only about 50 could actually lose their seats in a general election. The other 380 could only lose in a primary, so they care more about primaries, which makes it harder to compromise. So, you know, I think both parties have to think through this as well.
Okay, good. Well, that's hopeful. That's good. Another question here. U.S. civics is not taught general. Do you think voting interest would improve again if there was more emphasis on teaching civics?
Yes, and in fact, you know, one of the things I've been pushing for is both in high school and in college, like, you know, learning how to vote. Like, how do you fill out your vote? What does a signature mean? Why do you need to put it in a secrecy envelope? Like, we don't teach those things. And partially because the rules always change, but partially because it seems like a fundamentally, you know, we want to talk about like why the Constitution is important, but, you know, we need more people to participate. And so civics would be incredibly important. And I think it's something that should happen. And I know the University of Montana, again, is a leader on this. And, you know, I remember my freshman political science 101 class, my very first day, my professor read the lyrics to Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA to talk about the Vietnam War. And I thought to myself, oh my God, I picked my college right. This is perfect.
Great. Policy question for you here. Do you support a total wealth tax to replace our current structure?
No, I don't. Because I think that A, that will never pass, and B, I don't know how you define total wealth. I do think that the rich should pay more. I'm completely for that. But I also don't want to make it so people can't afford to start businesses. And I think we need real tax reform. I think the tax code is ridiculous. But I have questions about a wealth tax.
Okay, well, staying on the theme of money, how about election reform? Is that possible?
Yes, God, we need it. Like, you know, you look at these places, other places I do campaigns in, and, you know, the UK is a great example. By law, you can only spend 29 million pounds and you can do no paid TV ads. And they have higher voter turnout than we do. Now, I'm not saying they're panacea because they passed Brexit, but, you know, some of these other places, like the Spanish, I've done 3 Spanish national elections, and the entire by-law election period is 21 days. You can't do any electioning outside the 21 days. And they seem pretty happy in Spain. Tapas are great. Wine's amazing. You know, like that seems pretty good. I'm not saying we need to adopt European rules. Don't worry, Republicans on the phone, knock on socialists. But spending $4 billion in a presidential election seems overkill to me.
Yes, that seems a lot, doesn't it? And well, actually, I think we are about out of time. Yes, we're coming close to the 8:15 hour. And this has been really, again, quite enjoyable and very enlightening. Thank you so much, Jim, for participating in this dialogue. And I also want to thank, of course, all of our participants here. And also, I would like to tell everybody to out there to please join us next week. Professor Mia Abe will be discussing Japan-US-China relations. So please join us. And again, thank you, everybody. And a thank you, Jim. This has really been, again, quite delightful and quite, again, enlightening too. Thank you all. All right. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.